Yeah.
Hi, good morning. So we've got 10
Hi.
minutes with you, and please leave some time at the end for questions as well. Take it away.
No, we'll do. And thank you very much for your time. I will just take my submission as read, which I presume you've all had a copy of and read. Yeah, want to support the comments you would have heard earlier from Jonathan Carnegie and Josie. I would like to speak. You've got all the information there, statistics, figures in the submission. I'd just like to speak a bit more personally in terms of how this affects particularly the West Coast. So I just urge everyone on this committee to consider whether or not you wish to pass bad policy, because if you've read our submission, you'll know that that's very much what I think you're in danger of doing. And among several, if not many, consequences of passing that bad policy, one of the biggest impacts, I think, is that you'll take away people's opportunities and our prospects. So I was born on the West Coast. I live here, and I hope one day I'll probably die here, just not too soon. My grandparents, Anne and Fred, and my parents, Michael and Michelle, moved down here in the 1980s to become gold miners and West Coasters. And in so doing, in my opinion, they gave the best possible opportunity and upbringing to my siblings, Katie Wade and Charlotte and me. They pursued opportunities, and that's really what the mining industry on the West Coast, if you go back to the first Polynesians to set foot in these islands, cross from the Canterbury Plains through the Southern Alps, harvest Pounamu for the first time, and to go on to name the entire South Island Te Waipounamu, the waters of Greenstone. The first Chinese to call New Zealand home probably spoke Cantonese, but they came in pursuit of opportunities, and they called New Zealand Shenjin Shan, which translates as New Gold Mountain. And to this day, the mineral resources and the wealth of the West Coast presents people with opportunities. If you do as you're proposing to legislate to do, that will inhibit New Zealanders and West Coasters' ability to realise the value of their opportunities. And I don't really know what you achieve in doing that. Fundamentally, geology has predetermined what minerals exist. Human ingenuity and innovation has discovered certain applications for those minerals. People individually or collectively through markets or what have you decide which minerals they value and the price they wish to pay for them. And through government and legislation, we decide the social environmental parameters or laws within which those minerals can be utilised and harvested. But what I see in this legislation, if you'll read our submission, is, in my view, a perverse intention for the Crown as the custodian of those minerals on behalf of the people to effectively sterilise those resources. And if that's the desire or the intent of this legislation, then please reflect on that. And if it's not, change this legislation or throw this bill out. But all you're doing, and I just want to stress this, is you're taking away people's options and opportunities. So if I go back 12 or 13 years, when I was near the end of my time at high school, mining was humming. The West Coast had the highest average income in the country outside of Auckland and maybe Wellington. And the Crown wasn't just the owner and the custodian of the minerals of New Zealand, it was also New Zealand's largest miner through former state-owned enterprise Solid Energy. And just from my personal experience back then, rugby clubs, league clubs, boxing clubs were all just going gangbusters. Most of the coaches in the older clubs in those sports, older guys in those sports teams worked in mining. We were enjoying a high tide in the international commodity prices and investment in the industry. And a lot of that is dependent on offshore demand, market prices. I accept that, but government can control the policy that it passes. And that flows through to everything. I mean, schools, St. John's, fire brigades, sports teams. If there's not opportunities, there's not jobs. If there's not jobs, there's not communities. It's a pretty simple formula. Now, as for the miners, they've got wives, they've got husbands, they work locally as teachers, nurses, doctors, dentists, you name it. And opportunities do change and people change with the times, and the West Coast economy has diversified. But even to this day, between the primary sector and manufacturing, that still accounts for 50% of the West Coast region's GDP, which is twice as high as the rest of the country. And a lot of that manufacturing is still powered by coal and will be for some time. Now, I've been lucky enough through my life, even if it's just been part-time or holiday work. I've worked in workshops pulling old excavators apart, milked cattle. I've been a tour guide. I've worked in a freezing works. I've done a little conservation work, and I've had the pleasure of working in a lot of industries on the West Coast. But through my upbringing and through my current job, I've had the pleasure of visiting a lot of mines and meeting a lot of miners, and it's a fantastic line of work for people to be in. If you leave high school in fifth or sixth form because you don't have the ability or the inclination to go to higher study, and you can go into a job where you'll progress to earning $70,000 to $100,000 fairly early on, or maybe go on to go up the food chain, that gives you a strong base in life. And most people, even in their 20s or 30s, who are in that industry on the coast, they own their own houses. They've got stable families, machinery operators, diesel mechanics, geologists, drillers, ecologists, environmental technicians. accountants. It's a decent day's pay for a decent day's work, but that's only there because people have got the freedom to pursue those opportunities. And if you take that away, we increasingly just become a region where the options are to effectively earn minimum wage, pouring coffee and folding bed sheets, for visitors who burn fossil fuels to come and take photos of glaciers and mountains. And I'm just asking you to think about this before you rush this through under urgency and just to engage a bit further. But anyway, I'll leave it there, and I'm just happy to take any questions on anything I've said.
Thanks, Patrick. As you said, plenty of questions for you. Dan?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. You paint a good picture of how mining is intrinsically linked to the West Coast community. Now, other submitters have expressed support for the bill as it's part of a wider global effort to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And we've already seen some recent adverse weather events in New Zealand that have, they were unfathomable 20 years ago. And the West Coast in particular has had its fair share of flooding, and flooding that's more severe and frequent than 20 years ago. And then the West Coast, as you know, already has areas of land that have been affected by sea level rise. So suppose my question is, what would you say to those submitters and members of the community who see this bill as being part of a wider effort to fight climate change?
I think if you conflate simply the issue of mining on the West Coast, or even just as an industry, it's virtually every economic activity that we carry out impact on the climate. Stop my video, I'm losing a bit of internet. It has an impact on the climate. Mining's not unique in that we have other tools. We have a zero carbon plan, we have an emissions trading scheme, but don't single out mining just as one industry. I appreciate, as an image, coal being dug out of the ground or an oil well flaring looks symbolic of climate change, but it is a much more complex issue than that. And I would ask you to consider the complexity of the issue before consigning one industry to the history books.
Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you, Dan. Eugenie?
Thank you. This issue of consigning mining to the history books, and good to see you, Patrick.
Likewise,
there are a lot of farmers in Canterbury who see opportunities to use water for irrigation. We have a regulatory regime which attempts to have a range of different values and deal with those applications fairly. Why should mining be in a different position from other uses of land water?
I'm not should be in a different position. Do see what I see in this bill is an intent for the Crown to stop allocating resources. You've changed the wording from allocation to considering and processing permits and things like that, and it just looks like a step in that direction. I mean, and I think it's important to stress for people on this committee, we have a Resource Management Act and a Conservation Act and a Wildlife Act that governs the environmental impacts of mining, and we have other legislation for climate change. The Crown Minerals Act is little more than a Commercial Allocation Act as far as I'm concerned, and I don't think bringing those other statutes, I think it's statutory creep and it's mixing of issues personally.
Rather than just establishing a fair regulatory regime that's sufficient. Okay, that's your view. Thank you. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Stuart, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Patrick. Can you, Patrick, confirm that burning or utilising West Coast coal, metallurgical coal, actually lowers the emissions in steelmaking?
Yeah, there's peer-reviewed data for that, and I'm happy to source that and provide it to this committee. But effectively, yes, because of the efficiency gains from using West Coast coal, it does make the process of steel production in offshore markets, particularly India, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, that they consume less coal, in so doing lower emissions per unit of steel produced. So, if it's worth me biking to work and back each day to do my little bit, we're exporting some high value coal as a country, in my view, to do our little bit for the climate as well. So, yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks very much. Thank you, everyone on the committee. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Hi.